everyone. Welcome back to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and my husband, Bernhard Gunther. And on this episode, we are going to be discussing spiritual awakening or spiritual psychosis. So once you've been in spiritual communities long enough, you probably have begun to recognize a specific pattern that manifests in a certain persona of people who come back from ayahuasca retreats or from a spiritual retreat much worse than they were before. And sometimes these changes are small. Maybe they just have trouble adjusting to everyday life again. Maybe they just quit their job, go backpacking. They just seem a little ungrounded for a while, but then eventually they find their way back to everyday life. But in other cases, it can be more severe. Maybe they say something special was revealed to them on the retreat when they had an awakening experience. Maybe Jesus or aliens spoke to them and told them that they're here to save humanity. Or maybe they even realize that they're the reincarnation of Jesus or Mary Magdalene themselves. And you thought they went away for healing, but now they seem to have an air of superiority to them, like they found all the answers, that they are now a type of God. And most of the time, these delusions don't pan out. The person will hit a brick wall. They're faced with reality when others won't acknowledge how special they are. Maybe they'll isolate, or maybe they just keep chasing more and more ceremonies, engaging in more and more retreats, and they get hooked to this peak experience that they can offer. But sometimes these people are more organized. They give themselves special names and they'll create a new spiritual identity, a new brand. They'll begin telling people that spirit speaks to them in special ways, that they have access to special knowledge that no one else does. They might even begin to speak in a new language channeled from various beings. And there's usually one thing they all share in common: a lack of sincere psychological work, an avoidance of talking about trauma, childhood wounding, maybe a distinct lack of sincere shadow work, and they often want to forget completely their past and history and where they came from. And this is usually how New Age cults form and what happens when a genuine spiritual experience turns into spiritual narcissism. And in this social media age where we have an epidemic of narcissism, it's becoming increasingly more common. So the real question we have to ask ourselves, was this truly a spiritual awakening, or are they in what we would call spiritual psychosis? What are some common ways that people can tip into spiritual psychosis? What even is spiritual psychosis from our definition, and how does this link into this idea of Stalin Askarof's idea of spiritual emergency? And what happens when you have a spiritual experience, but you have a lot of unhealed trauma and your sense of self, your ego isn't strong enough to integrate what happened in a healthy way? What are some signs you may be experiencing this? What are some signs you may be dealing with someone who's maybe experiencing this, or instead of a true teacher, you're dealing with someone who's dealing with inflation? All of these things we're going to unpack and uncover in this podcast.
And before we dive deeper into this topic, a quick announcement. I still have a few spots left in my upcoming 10-week live training and program, Mastering Spiritual Warfare, Unveiling the Unseen Forces and the Path to Embodied Sovereignty. It is a 10-week spiritual warrior training in discernment, protection, and divine alignment, very necessary for the time of transition we're in right now. And I'll be going deeper into more practical applications of many of the topics we're talking about in this podcast and also this episode. The next round starts July 15th until September 20th. It's limited to 40 participants. We're about 90% full, and you can learn more about it at the website masteringspiritualwarfare.com.
So first, we're going to start with defining spiritual psychosis. I just want to make clear, this is not really a recognized psychological term. They would probably just call it psychosis, but it's a term that's been floating online for some time now. And so where I disagree with some of the online discourse of this is that a lot of people under the materialistic lens who discount spiritual experiences, they say that all spiritual experiences of a transpersonal nature, you contact certain beings, certain forces, they say all of that is spiritual psychosis, right? So any spiritual experience you have is spiritual psychosis. So I'm going to disagree with that fundamental learning, because it's based on the materialistic lens. In my view, there is real spiritual experiences, that there is real spiritual beings that you can contact. So I want to define what we are saying when we speak of spiritual psychosis. So essentially, we're referring to a loss of contact with reality after a spiritual experience. So this can happen in any way in any method that gives you an altered state. So psychedelics, breath work, some sort of Kundalini awakening, intense meditation retreats, any experience where someone maybe had an altered state of consciousness. They had visions, delusions of grandeur, paranoia, and then suddenly they seem to be inflated with ideas that they are either a messiah, a god, Jesus, in contact with certain spirits, aliens, other realms, right? And I'm not dismissing that these other spirits and other realms are real. I'm saying that someone has a distorted perception of what's happening. So if you were to ask the mainstream medical model what this is, they would just call it hallucination, psychosis, which medication is the only cure. This is because modern psychology, under the materialistic model, does not acknowledge a genuine transpersonal spiritual experience. So obviously, if you've listening to our podcast, we tend to go beyond that model in this podcast. We acknowledge that the spiritual experience they have may have been real, but it has been both misinterpreted and mismanaged, mainly because the person's ego strength, not like arrogance, was not strong enough to hold it, to have that genuine spiritual experience. And basically the container was not strong enough to hold it so that it could be integrated into their life in a healthy way. So ultimately, spiritual psychosis is an awakening experience, a state of altered consciousness that opens someone up to visions or delusions of grandeur. And it will tend to lead in one of two directions: inflation or fragmentation, which we'll talk about in a moment. So now I just want to map this onto Stanislav Grof's idea of spiritual emergency. So essentially, a spiritual psychosis, I want to define as a spiritual emergency gone wrong. So he defines spiritual emergency as something that happens when we have a peak or transpersonal experience and it breaks through into our reality with such intensity that it overwhelms our ego's capacity to integrate it. So he acknowledges that the experience itself may be genuine, meaning the person has made contact with powerful spiritual forces beyond the personality, but the personality was not strong enough to hold it. And they tend to experience a disrupted sense of functioning in their life after that wasn't there before, which is the key thing, basically. So if you were dysfunctional and in psychosis before, and then that's not a spiritual emergency, but if you were relatively stable and then you have the spiritual experience and your life falls apart, that in his view is a true spiritual emergency. So this person could have had powerful visions, maybe a powerful surging of physical energy, of Kundalini energy, but it basically becomes destabilizing and disrupting to their ordinary function. And Grof identified various triggers: breathwork, psychedelics, meditation, near-death experiences, even childbirth, or very intense creative or sexual experiences. Doesn't mean they always cause spiritual emergency, but they can cause it. And the content they encounter is often archetypal. So encounters with death and rebirth, divine figures, past lives, cosmic unity. It's basically an experience that opens you up to material of what Jung would call the collective unconscious. And what we encountered there are archetypes, entities, beings, and many powers that belong to something beyond the personal self, your personal history, your personal unconscious. They're collective in nature.
All right, so let's look into what tends to happen when this type of spiritual emergency is not integrated. So instead of what usually happens, instead of the hardened ego dissolving and the person turning into a more humble, more healed, more grounded, integrated version of themselves, they tend to either tip into two directions. And that's important. It's either inflation or fragmentation. So when they inflate, they will then do what Carl Jung calls identifying with the archetypes, which he said is very dangerous to the development. Suddenly the language becomes very centered around the fact that they are, for example, chosen, special. Perhaps they even make claims that they are a Pleiadian, an alien, or some sort of holy figure, a self-proclaimed starseed, for example, or light worker who's been giving special codes to awaken humanity. Or you can also take on a very rigid religious identity as well, dogmatically. It goes both ways. Or they fragment, which means they slowly lose the connection to themselves, even more their relationships, and they tend to isolate from others as they psychologically disintegrate. But in both cases, it's important to point out that the person loses their connection to reality. Now, the issue, as Laura just mentioned with conventional psychiatry, is that this happens, they would label it as a psychosis, hallucination, and jump in and just medicate the person, just put them on drugs and whatnot, right? Because obviously, materialistic psychiatry and psychology denies that these spiritual experiences are real. So the drug is there to suppress the experience entirely, which doesn't heal it, which sets off a whole other array of problems and issues down the road. And then the person goes numb, right? The transpersonal connection would likely become disconnected, and they often get stuck in some sort of frozen state, right? And then they are just being held functional on psychiatric drugs or even getting institutionalized. So really, a spiritual psychosis is a spiritually emergency that leads to inflation. And this is a big epidemic, especially nowadays, that also relates to a previous podcast we recorded on spiritual narcissism and spiritual grandiosity. We have a whole range of epidemic and surge of people selling themselves, calling themselves, special messengers, or who have special codes, special knowledge, getting all kinds of special transmissions from God or aliens or other beings that only they have access to, and you need them to access all of that. And many people fall for it nowadays. It's very fascinating. Even this whole surge of remote viewing is becoming very popular, I've noticed, and certain people have special insights and connection to certain beings. And I've noticed that many people fall for it. And the reason for it is that many people struggle with actually shame and low self-esteem. So we tend to admire people who present themselves as very confident, who are charismatic, who seem actually superior to us, and have access to something which we don't, right? They even speak in a language that may seem kind of confusing at first, but also exotic and fascinating. They speak about ascension in ways that seems very complex, but it's also mostly some sort of new age mumbo jumbo that can mean anything. So just complexity not equals truth. And they tend to place themselves on a pedestal and speak of advanced and very against special knowledge. So we may buy into that and think that they are above us too, right? It really appeals to people's ego and the part of us that wants to be special, that also wants to be seen, that wants to be just like them. It very much ties into golden shadow projection, positive shadow projection, and based on Jungian psychology, which we also talked about in the previous podcast as well. But very important to understand that genuine spiritual experiences are not there to make you feel more special, right? It's not about accessing something that the ego feeds off and makes you more elevated over others, right? It's usually supposed to make you more human, more humble, more grounded, more integrated, more compassionate, and also more capable of relating to people with basic love and respect, rather than needing to place yourselves as someone extraordinary. Again, but these true, powerful spiritual experiences can be extremely hard to integrate because they can destabilize us if we don't have what in psychoanalytic terms is called ego strength.
Yeah, so I want to just point that out. So the ego loves and almost immediately takes credit for a powerful spiritual experience. I've even noticed this in myself, especially, I was having some very powerful Uranus transits when I was going to India, and whenever I had a powerful experience, my ego would be like, this means I am special, like God has chosen me, right? The ego immediately has this tendency to want to take credit for a spiritual experience and hijack it. It's like a reflex of the nature, right? So there's that. And then I also want to point out, when you're having a very powerful spiritual experience, it puts you in an altered state of consciousness. It's extremely destabilizing. And I mean, in a true spiritual experience, there will be some degree of loss of functioning in ordinary life. It literally puts you into an altered state of consciousness. You know, I remember when I had some of very powerful spiritual experiences, one of the questions I would ask myself is, how am I supposed to function in life like this? And there's a reality to that we lose our sense of ordinary functioning. So I just want to point out there's a reason why they're destabilizing. I would argue it happens to mostly everyone. And a lot of the issue is that we don't actually have a lot of safe containers where we can integrate spiritual experiences in a healthy way, which is what Stanislav Grof pointed out himself. So let's talk about ego strength. So the reason why fragmentation or inflation happens when someone has a spiritual awakening experience is because of something that is termed ego strength. So what do we mean by a strong ego? This is highly misunderstood in spiritual context because it's all about dissolving the ego, right? When people think of ego, we usually think of someone who's either full of themselves or arrogant. But ego strength in psychological terms is actually healthy and necessary when engaging with inner work and just in general when you're navigating the complexities of life. So in Jung's model of the psyche, the ego is basically the I, your center of conscious awareness. A strong ego does not mean you're narcissistic. It means you have a healthy degree of self-awareness where you can relate to contents of your psyche without being identified with them. So I can have a bad feeling without thinking I am a bad person, for example. So ego strength in general might mean that you can feel difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You can tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity, and not knowing without rushing into a comfortable belief or story. And remember, we're all trying to build this. It's not like you need to have perfect ego strength, but you need to understand the general aim. Another aspect is you can take in critical feedback without either collapsing into shame or going into defensiveness. A big aspect of ego strength is being able to witness your thoughts and feelings without either dissociating from them or completely identifying with them. So meaning if I'm feeling self-critical or if you're feeling self-critical, you can observe those critical thoughts without immediately buying into the stories that means that you're a terrible, flawed person. Or you don't need to defensively dissociate by pretending that those feelings don't exist, or you distract yourself from them by covering them up with like a spiritual bypass type story, right? And then one of the big aspects of ego strength is being able to hold paradox. So paradoxal views within yourself and your relationships. For example, you can allow yourself to make mistakes and still believe in your inherent goodness. Or on the opposite, in your relationships, you can allow someone to do something that hurts or disappoints you without you splitting and then suddenly calling them an evil person. So this is ultimately the goal. And you can see it's like a fruit of psychological work as well. And it's a fruit of even spiritual practices, being able to observe feelings and thoughts without identifying with them. So I think the main issue and why you might be listening to this and being like, well, that's not that common. It's actually not, because if you think about it, 50% of people have insecure attachment, right? And ego strength tends to develop through an environment in childhood that creates secure attachment. So an environment where we're emotionally held well enough as infants that we can tolerate this idea that we can both love and be frustrated by the same person. So this ego strength, and along with secure attachment, develops in response to how our mother responded to our own vulnerable feelings. So how did she meet us when we were crying, angry, upset? That later becomes a template for how we meet or don't meet those difficult emotions in ourselves and others. So, a lot of us have to actually work and develop this ego strength as adults, because it's not the template that was created within us as children, basically. So there's two kinds of egos, an overly rigid one and a fragile one. So an overly rigid ego will be defensive. They'll be overly rational, dismissive emotions, and they tend to become very controlling of themselves or others under stress. Whereas fragile egos are overwhelmed. They tend to find emotional regulation difficult. They struggle to function because they feel either at the mercy of their own feelings and moods. They feel at the mercy of what other people say and do to them, other people's opinions of them. They feel at the mercy of their own compulsive emotions and their reactions. So how could we apply this idea of a fragile ego to spiritual psychosis? So let me just give you an example to kind of ground this in reality. So say someone goes to an ayahuasca retreat and they carry years of childhood trauma and very deep shame. And a lot of us do carry very deep shame, by the way. So this is like a very popular example. So during the ceremony, they suddenly feel very loved. Maybe the grandmother comes in and like pours onto them unconditional love. And suddenly they feel very cosmically significant, very connected to the universe, right? So their fragile ego, who's unable to tolerate this idea that they have flaws or maybe they are ordinary, then can latch on to that experience and inflate from it. So the experience doesn't soften their ego and instead hardens into a new inflated identity. So the feeling of being loved then turns into, I am special. God has chosen me. The Divine Mother is speaking to me. This becomes a new identity that further suppresses them from feeling that underlying shame underneath from that childhood trauma. So then they come back from the ceremony and maybe they give themselves a new name or say that they are the Divine Mother or channel for the Divine Mother itself. They present themselves as this kind of chosen one. Maybe they believe they've been given a special mission. So, if you believe that you're cosmically chosen by God, the wound itself doesn't need to be explored, but it's really running the show from the unconscious. And this need to feel superior to others because they had this feeling of unconditional love is just a defense around that their wounded child needs to create because they still underlyingly feel inferior to others. So the shame gets buried under this new inflated identity. So you see this whole kind of chosen one community narrative in spiritual communities. And the depth of the grandiosity of the personality is in direct proportion to the shame it's covering up. So, they latch on to this universal feeling of unconditional love, and then the ego then creates a new identity out of it, basically. So it actually hardens around that experience. And what the ego is doing, which we'll talk about in the second hour, is they're identifying with the archetypal experience rather than witnessing and experiencing it and not merging with it. If you've been getting value from these conversations and want to go deeper, we'd love to invite you to join our membership, where for just $11 a month with additional savings if you choose a 6-month or yearly membership, you'll unlock over 176 hours of exclusive members-only content that goes far beyond what we can cover in the public podcast. This is how you can access the second hour of every podcast we have ever recorded, which is categorized by topics like awakening and spirituality, shadow work and psychology, spiritual warfare and occult forces, esoteric astrology and cosmic cycles, and relationships and love, and where in general we discuss the deeper spiritual dynamics behind world events. The second hour also allows us to discuss topics that have been previously censored on social media and other platforms, and to have completely open discussions we can't always have on the first hour. Along the way, we share practical tools and insights to help you cultivate discernment, deepen your inner work, and navigate this time of transition with greater awareness. As a member, you'll also gain access to our private Piercing the Veil of Reality community forum, where seekers from around the world can come together to discuss these topics, share their experiences, ask questions, and support one another. Your membership is one of the most practical ways to support our work. It allows us to remain independent, keep these podcasts completely ad-free so we can continue creating uncensored content that we hope serves people all over the world. If that resonates with you, we'd love to have you join us. Visit veilofreality.com/membership to join. We look forward to welcoming you into the community.
All right, so Laura just shared about what happens when the fragile ego inflates. Now let's look at what happens with someone with a fragile ego that fragments. So again, similar example, go into some intense breathwork retreat or ayahuasca experience or any intense spiritual experience, whatever it may be, and they experience a feeling of merging with everything, with God, a sense of oneness. But because their ego structure was not stable enough to actually hold that experience while staying anchored in the body, they come back to everyday life feeling even further dissociated and disembodied, basically. And the symptoms for that, when a fragile ego fragments, so to speak, is when things don't feel real, right? They don't feel real. They may struggle actually to hold a conversation, to maintain relationships, instead of the experience expanding them and further ungrounded them, so to speak. And then the ego hijacks it in the way, and they start to use spiritual language to cover it up, right? For example, they may say they're just accessing non-dual awareness. They live outside duality. They are not a real person anymore, that life is just a dream, maya, an illusion, right? Very common, this kind of spiritual bypass. And yes, these ideas are real from a higher perspective, but they're using it, again, as a bypass to avoid the basic fact that they have become extremely disassociated. And this is very common. This is a very common spiritual bypass delusion to mistake states of disembodiment and dissociation for spiritual awakening or states of non-duality. Now, with inflation, at least, there's a new identity that can be functional enough to build a life around, even maybe a whole career, so to speak. But with fragmentation, everyday life, work, routine, and relationships tend to disintegrate, meaning they're unable to perform basic tasks, hold responsibilities, not even showing up on time for basic appointments. They become hard to reach in relationships, not responding for long periods of time. And when they do, they don't seem to be at all there at all, kind of checked out, dissociated. And most importantly, even basic life responsibilities, just paying your bills, paying the rent, feeding themselves, taking care of their bodies, and life could become very difficult. And then on top of it, they use this disintegrated state as an excuse not to take care of their responsibilities, everyday responsibilities. It's a very vicious downward spiral under the illusion that they are awake, right? So they may feel oddly distant from those around them. They may use spiritual concepts, again, to mask it up as nothing is real, all is an illusion anyway. I've transcended the world. I've transcended the matrix. And usually people like this end up floating around in life. They become nomads. They tend to leech off others, constantly asking for money or donations, so to speak. They're chasing the next retreat, the next ceremony, the next peak experience, the next high, but never really truly grounding and integrating their insights. And then they come back from retreats again, and they can no longer function in everyday life. They feel actually more depressed than before. Relationships become very difficult. And most often they also tend to say I'm too sensitive, too open, or just too much of an empath. I'm too much of an empath. I cannot be around people, which ironically, it's almost the ego literally hijacking the idea of being an empath and turning it on itself and being very narcissistically concerned about one's own state and not truly care, unlike an empath, for other people. So this becomes very, very complicated, so to speak. They start spending more and more time seeking peak experiences while they disconnect from everyday life. That's really the biggest symptom of a fragmented ego disintegrating, because spending time with the ordinary world becomes very unbearable. And then instead of seeking some very grounded psychological support and psychological work for what comes up, instead of grounding into their body and finding actually a new way to integrate it into their life, they find themselves drifting further and further away from it all while pretending they're awake or they're too alien. I'm too much of a starseed. I don't really belong here to humanity. I'm too awake and too special to be part of this humanity. I've transcended it all. And the spiritual experience that was meant to bring them actually closer to everything, more embodied, more integrated, ends up leaving them more ungrounded than ever.
So I just want to pipe in here because I really want to demystify this and also decrease the potential shame that people might be feeling around this. Because the reason, that a lot of these examples, by the way, I wrote and created, because it is something that happened, at least in part, to me. For example, when I went to a Vipassana retreat, I had a very powerful experience there of divine grace, the seventh day in or something, this Vipassana retreats where you go by donation. It's 10 days meditation all day, every day. And then when you leave, they say, hey, you need to meditate for 2 hours a day in order to like continue this practice, right? So I did that religiously when I got back, and I did feel like I was accessing a state of non-dual awareness, but I was actually incredibly dissociated. I didn't have all of these symptoms. Actually, one of the things that helped me is at that point in my life, I was working on a farm. So I was working with my hands. I was working with the earth, which I really think is a great cure for being ungrounded. It's like give someone a tedious task with the earth to like reconnect with it. But I thought that I was accessing non-dual awareness when I was actually very dissociated. So the way that I was taught to practice Vipassana meditation, even though you're doing a scan in the body, was actually making me scan past difficult emotions. So I meditate very differently now, and I wasn't completely unable to function, but I was becoming very dissociated from that practice. And I thought that it was a higher level of consciousness, but it wasn't really helping me. So I just want to say that this can be extremely common, where we can use meditation as a socially acceptable form of dissociation. So, and I also want to demystify this, that I want to point out that spiritual experiences, a true powerful experience, like spiritual awakening experience, is destabilizing by nature. It is. It's just like it's so powerful that it breaks past the personal. So the reason we're having this podcast is because it's so fundamental to understand, and it's so fundamental to notice when this is happening to us, so we can bring ourselves back to earth and back to reality.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for sharing. I can also, have my own experiences with that kind of inflation as well, especially in my psychedelic days, medicine plant days, or pretending to be a starseed light worker and all of this kind of stuff. Coming clearly from a wounded inner child, or the ego needing to prop itself up and all of that.
Yeah, and maybe even this idea that I'm an alien was coming from your own feelings of alienation and dissociation,
yeah, that's the irony
right?
of, exactly.
Yeah.
So we looked at the fragile ego. Now let's explore what happens with the rigid ego. So again, for example, if someone with a more controlling or defensive ego goes onto a retreat and has a genuine opening, a spiritual experience, maybe they finally cry, get into some real contact with the pain or something beyond themselves, something they have suppressed and repressed for not only years, but decades and weren't even aware of. But finally, the rigid ego structure breaks it down a bit. But then the rigid ego comes back and could clamp down on the experience in a few ways. So they will either dismiss it or intellectualize it. They may dismiss it entirely. Maybe they will hop onto the religious fundamentalist train, which is very common. That happens oftentimes when the experience opened up so much that it actually terrified them. So they turn on the experience entirely and demonize it, which means, for example, instead of, ayahuasca made me confront my demons, it will become ayahuasca opened me up to demons, when it was really their unhealed pain. And that's really classical projection, an internal experience that's too threatening to own or to really integrate gets attributed to an external source instead. So instead of saying, I felt overwhelmed by my own pain, it becomes an external evil force attacked me. It's very, very common. I see this a lot, this issue of differentiation. Also, so many people seeing entities everywhere when it's most often their own fragmented, very dissociated, scared or fearful or angry inner child part comes up, or shadow part, and they mistake that as an entity or project an entity onto that.
And I just also want to add, obviously, you've been listening to this podcast for some time. You know that Bernhard and I we do acknowledge that there is, negative, hostile spiritual forces. But one of the main points we've made on many podcasts, time and time again, is unless you know your own shadow, your own unhealed pain, and your own personal demons, how can you differentiate between something that's coming from within and something that's coming from out there? So the part that we agree on with the religious fundamentalists is that there are, negative, hostile spiritual forces which do not belong to the personal self. But the part that we fundamentally disagree on is that unless you know your own inner world, you cannot tell between a demon within you and a demon out there. Because basically what happens is everything that's that's negative gets appealed to an external demon within that framework. And then the issue with that is that you can easily cast out a very wounded part of you in attempt to exorcise a demon, which is basically kind of what's happening here.
Which can make things worse.
Much worse. So if you say that basically ayahuasca confronted you with a very wounded child part, and then you labeled it demonic, right? And then you just cast it out and shut it out and say that's a demon, you are literally cutting yourself off from the source of spontaneity, trust. That wound, that child within you is very sacred.
So on that note, real quick, a lot of damage has been done in the name of Christian exorcism. Not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but the denial of psychology and not understanding psychology. Even nowadays, a lot of fundamentalists demonize Carl Jung, and psychology is not needed, just accept Jesus and everything else is demonic. That has created even more psychological fragmentation and ironically more entry points for these dark forces, which definitely exist.
Yes.
And that's the whole point of my program, Mastering Spiritual Warfare, this differentiation. But let's go back to the rigid ego. So after the emotional opening that happened on the retreat, then the lack of integration and understanding opens up a new crusade, so to speak, a war against themselves. The pain gets again buried under a new righteous identity, most often a very strong religious identity, fundamentalist identity that takes the difficult feelings that they were exposed to within to an enemy out there. And then what is the new enemy? It might be psychedelics, ayahuasca, the medicine plant world, the new age in a very generalized word, anything they can make up a carrier for evil. Even Carl Jung in psychology becomes demonized, right? Or being blamed, so to speak. So then the ego hardens again in the direct proportion to its fear of the material that was shown to it. Now, the tragedy of it all is that the crying, the grief that actually happened in that opening, in that ceremony, retreat, or whatever the instance was probably the healthiest thing that happened to the person in years. But the ego was too rigid to let it soften. Instead, it says never, never again and shuts down the experience entirely and hardens against it further. Now, this also reminds me of what Carl Jung said, that religion is a defense mechanism against the experience of God.
Yeah. And what's interesting is this term, never again, is a very common term in internal family systems theory that protectors say when they harden. So basically, when you develop a rigid fundamentalist identity, it's basically like a protector subpersonality to protect you against the pain of that unhealed inner child. And so what happens is these protectors develop very extreme roles, and they play very extreme roles in our lives. And what they say is never again. I need to harden into this fundamentalist worldview. So I never again need to feel this pain. I never again need to feel this vulnerable. So let's talk about the rigid ego that intellectualized experience, which is also common. I want to also say, I've also done this. So this one's also based on personal experience.
That sounds pretty familiar to me too.
So basically the same thing happens. They go on retreat. A real spiritual experience happens. Maybe they finally feel a grief they've been carrying for decades. But instead, going fundamentalist, they reframe what happened as some sort of new age concept. Now, I haven't done this part, but I've done other parts of this. So instead of saying, I finally processed childhood trauma, they could say, I activated dormant DNA codes. Because this feels safer because it means they don't have to show vulnerability. Or maybe it becomes, I'm in 5D now, I'm fully healed, I've transcended. Instead of saying, I finally realized how lonely I felt my whole life, it becomes, I activated my heart chakra. So they create some distance. So there's a distinct lack of and a sense of vulnerability, and instead it becomes this kind of new age language, right? Or they could, instead of saying, I realized that my whole life I've been performing for people in order to earn life, it becomes, I've exited the matrix. So the rigid ego covers up what happened into a neat explanation. So another more sophisticated way this could happen, and this is definitely something that I did for a period, is that they have this powerful experience and then they jump into more books, more information, more studying. They want to find a way to intellectually get a grasp on what happened, but then it ends up becoming a way of bypassing and reflecting on and integrating what actually happened with the experience. So they maybe order tons of books to research what happened rather than sitting deeply with what came up and what this means for their life now. So they can consume endless information on the topic while their daily relationships and habits stay the same as they were before they had this experience, which is really the clue. And that's kind of the clue that woke me up, is like I had all these powerful experiences. My meditation practice, my yoga practice was like doing hours a day, but my relationships were in the same condition as they were before. So that was actually the red flag for me and put me down the road of integrating psychology into what I had been doing. And they might even become a very knowledgeable person, maybe the most knowledgeable person in their friend group on the subject. But rather than using the information to become more compassionate and open to those friends, the ego just wants this explanation, this certainty, this knowledge. And I also want to acknowledge this can be helpful at times because our mind likes to have explanations for what happened. We like to understand it. We like to comprehend it. But we also want to make sure that the information level of knowing is not taking us away from going within, reflecting on the experience, reflecting on how we've changed now, reflecting on maybe the changes that we need to make in our relationships in response to the things that we experienced in that spiritual opening. So it's really about taking the time to really just sit with what happened and to reflect on it, to reflect on your own life without just jumping into intellectualization on its own. That's important. So what makes the New Age particularly dangerous is that conventional psychology tends to have alarm bells for these patterns when they're occurring. So a therapist or psychologist ideally would see that you have a loss of functioning in the world, that you have an incapacity for healthy relationships. They would see the rigid ego, they would see the dissociation, and they would seek to find ways to stabilize you and help you process what happened emotionally. But the issue with the kind of New Age spiritual scene is they can often have the opposite response. So the person or the community can reframe the loss of functioning in spiritual terms that makes them feel special. Like, okay, you've transcended the matrix. Your inability to tolerate everyday conversations is because everyone's low vibration. And then they'll reframe the issues that they're having in their life and their relationships as proof that they're superior or special or chosen. And, you know, people build whole brands off of this. They'll create a whole new language. You know, they'll say things that like are very hard to confirm because they've just made it up. You know, they dress in certain spiritual clothing. And the fundamental issue is that we open up to forces in the transpersonal, in the collective unconscious, when we open ourselves up to what Carl Jung would call the archetypes, or what others would call spiritual forces that exist outside the personal self. And our ego isn't stable enough to experience what happened without identifying with those forces or shutting down the experience. This is how a powerful spiritual experience can leave us worse than we were before.
So one of the big and really primary issues with all of that and within our current culture is that we tend to actually actively support and worship inflated egos. Again, we are in the epidemic of narcissism, and ties into what Krishnamurti called that pathology has become normalized nowadays. Now, a very interesting book that was written in 1979 called The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch. And he argued that America was shifting away from a culture built on genuine achievement and community towards a culture of increasingly defined self-absorption and a desperate need for external validation. Interestingly, literally written 1979.
I know, it's concerning.
It's concerning. No? So he pointed out back then, nearly 50 years ago, that our culture had lost its shared moral framework, meaning its connection to history, and a sense of genuine community, which left people starving for meaning with no any real way to find it. And Carl Jung pointed this out in his own way, meaning in absence in a relationship to God, to the transcendental, to spirit, to the divine, people end up worshiping the world or themselves as substitutes for God. That's really what's happening. You can see this fully in display in the modern looks-maxing trend, for example, where this obsession with the perfection of the physical self, or the physical body, the identification of the body has become the ultimate project. Lash also pointed out that modern cults promise relief. They give you an escape from this slow, painful work of being with your wounds and limitations, right? Now, in spiritual terms, now you can receive a download, right? You get a DNA upgrade or dissolve into oneness and bypass all of it, bypass all the humanity, so to speak. The idea of transformation gets sold instead of the real thing. Now, what's crazy again, that he all discovered this in 1979, well before social media, before wellness became a billion-dollar industry, before ayahuasca retreats were being advertised on Instagram and everywhere. And the internet just accelerated something that's already been happening for decades and is just increasing exponentially. So when someone comes back again from a ceremony announcing they are chosen, they have received special downloads, they have a new name, all of that they've been giving a mission to save humanity. They're selling actually the same narcissism as someone showing off their money, cars, and status just dressed up in a new costume. That all becomes God, right? Like money is the God for a lot of people, materialism, possession is the God for many people, even romantic relationships, finding the perfect partner, God projected on that, celebrity culture, whatever it may be. The loss of the divine connection and a true connection to God, we have all these substitutes for it. But now we have this spiritual materialism as a substitute for that. So instead of teaching how to make money and get the girls, so to speak, they're teaching you how to become God, find your twin flame, channel alien beings, astral project, and all of this. And by doing so, they are, again, bypassing the thing that humans actually need right now, which is the thing that would actually change their lives and the relationships in a grounded, more fundamental level that will also truly help humanity, by extension, to become a healthier ego. So, again, a healthier ego means that we're not, again, talking about ego in the popular sense of what people believe it is, meaning just arrogant or self-important or the need for attention. We're talking about healthy ego strength in the psychological sense, which meaning is the foundation of a functional, healthy self. Being grounded in reality, being able to look at yourself clearly, not through the lens of how special you are, right? The need to be special, by the way, is a big sign as well that there's some lack of ego strength. And because I've heard this a lot, people asking what's wrong with being special and this and that, people kind of try to challenge me on that. And I say, well, what within you needs to be special? Yes, we are all unique expressions of God, but what is the need to be seen as special?
Yeah.
Where's that coming from?
And the reality is, okay, so maybe what they're pointing at is we are all special in the eyes of God, but the key word is we are all. So if we're all special, no one is special either.
Exactly. And then even bringing up why even need to be seen or feel special, right?
Yes.
So that most often hints more of an inner wound of a fragile ego that needs to be seen as special.
Well, no, I think what probably happened is at a certain phase of childhood development, we do need to actually feel
exactly.
special
So
to the parent.
There was a lack of attunement.
Exactly. So we weren't actually felt as special. There was a lack of attunement, a lack of that holding environment as a child. And then later on, our whole life, we are looking for what we didn't get from our parents in the world, essentially.
Yeah. So the key point is to see yourself as you actually are. It means the capacity to be with your difficult emotions without identifying with them, without being overwhelmed by them or running away from them, but even allowing yourself to feel them as well at the same time, to be able to sit with grief, with sadness, with shame, anger, and then not project them onto others who we feel or judge as asleep or caught in the matrix. Right? Not to blame the other world. We see this a lot in the truth of conspiracy movement, to blame the world for their own lives and, unhappiness, so to speak. And it also means to be able to look at the parts of yourself that are painful, the ways You repeat the same dynamics in relationships over and over again, the same patterns, without blaming your ex or your partner or whole genders, all men are evil or all women suck, or whatever it may be. And to be able to learn then the skills to heal the parts of who that are driving you, right? To able to integrate them, to have more honest and authentic conversations with others as well. It means to be able to communicate, the ability to be in real relationship with real people, not just online on comments and chat forums and whatnot, to be able to repair conflict, to tolerate being misunderstood, right? Without right away collapsing, to stay present with another human being, even if it's uncomfortable. Now, none of that is obviously glamorous. You cannot build a brand around it, really. It won't make you look more special. It will make you simply more human. But this is then the actual work. Real psychological and spiritual transformation is not about ascending into some higher dimension, but becoming more capable of really being present in this one by grounded psycho-spiritual work. And really, if you look throughout history, the greatest teachers throughout history were not advertising how special and enlightened they were, how psychic they were, or how many special codes and downloads or transmissions they had. They were known for how compassionate they were and how they never placed themselves above other humans, but was willing to walk with them side by side.
I think the real test for a lot of awakening, and there's this amazing post by therapist Terry Real, which I've just been thinking about for weeks now, where he talked about you can have a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-knowledge, but be really bad at relationships. And I think this is fundamentally a lot of the issues that we see in communities that are centered around awakening or spirituality, is that we need, unless we're bringing it into our lives and our relationships, what good is it? And that's the real test, right? It's like you can have a lot of knowledge of yourself, but still not know how to repair after a conflict, not know how to not react to your own emotions, to not project on the person the people that you're with. Like that's really where a lot of the work comes in. And the reason that we're saying this is not as a judgment to other people. It's because I've gone through this and I'm still learning a lot myself. So a lot of this is stuff that I've learned through direct experience. Obviously, also, we've been in spiritual communities for some time now. So we've seen, we'll share a little bit more about that, our own personal experiences in the second hour. But I've just seen so much of this within myself, within others. I'm sure if you've been involved in spiritual communities, you've seen a little bit of this too, right? So now as we end part one, for those who are new to our podcast, we always have a part two, which is only for members. And we're going to cover how to actually integrate a spiritual awakening, starting with what Jung meant by, identifying with the archetypes versus relating to the archetypes. We're going to cover also an idea that Jung and Edward Edinburgh especially really outlined beautifully, called the ego-self axis, what a genuine healthy relationship to self actually feels like. We're also going to unpack this kind of wound between this idea of the starseed identity. Another big thing is why awakening tends to bring up unprocessed trauma. And so we're going to look at through the lens of Jung, Aurobindo. We're going to look at that through the psychosynthesis model. We're going to share about what Groff's has actually helped someone through a spiritual emergency. We're also going to talk about grandiosity. So one of the big things with grandiosity, Robert Moore said this, Terry Real also said this, is we all struggle with some degree of grandiosity. There's no one who's exempt from it, but it's about how we relate to it. So I really want to unpack that. We also want to talk about how the three things that will help you deal with that grandiosity: the need for psychological discernment when doing inner work, the signs that distinguish a healthy ego from an inflated one. So if any of what we've discussed already has been useful to you, hour two is where it really is going to come together. So you can find it along with over 176 hours of our second hour of every podcast and every episode we've ever done by joining us at veilofreality.com/membership. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you on the other side.